Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given.
I don't like the stereotypes around this topic.
Right.
And I don't like the oversimplifications.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's why I wanted to have you discuss it and break it down.
I started to think about what you said, and I was not a codependent person at all. So because you were abused doesn't make you codependent.
Right.
That's where I get what you're saying, because I started to think about and listen to what you said. And I'm like, no, that is what he liked, that I was independent. He didn't want to work. So he knew I made good money and, I was independent and I could take care of the kids. But I became codependent because it was a survival mechanism.
Right. There's almost a kind of a fishing. They pull you in and pull you in and pull you in. Yeah.
But then I think once I got out, I became sort of codependent because I couldn't really function that well independently yet because of 22 years.
Yeah. It's a tricky thing.
It's very tricky.
Yeah. Did I tell you guys that I came out of an abusive marriage?
You did on the last podcast.
So it's all been kind of the same journey. Everything you just described, same. And so you just have to, learn as you go and talk to other people who got out or who are trying to get out. And
Yeah,
it
is. And it is so important to become independent and be around people that want you to be independent.
Yes.
that want you to be the best you can be. And that's what I really liked about what you have to say. So
Lord, thanks for a chance to speak truth, because I know that all three of us believe that truth will set captives free. I pray that the captives you have in mind will find this truth and inhale it deeply, and that tonight, while we put this together, that you would breathe on the time that we spend. In Jesus' name.
Jesus' name.
Yes, amen.
Amen. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Brenda J. We are so excited to bring Bob Hamp back to the show. Bob is a licensed therapist and founder of the Think Different Counseling, Consulting, and Connecting Center. He has been in private practice and worked in the church for a combined 30 years of practice. Besides his service of private practice and organizational consulting, he spent 10 years developing a group discipleship strategy called Freedom Ministries to help thousands of people find freedom from a broad range of struggles. Bob explained the dynamics of abuse on podcasts 54 and 55, which are just amazing. And the 1-minute trailer, wow. It is one of our most downloaded podcasts to date, and with good reason. So welcome back to the show, Bob.
Thank you, guys. Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to talk about codependency. A couple of years ago, I read a book on this topic, and I can't remember one thing that I read, which is not good. I suppose I was still in trauma brain, which so are many of our listeners. When I attend Celebrate Recovery, one of the common struggles that people talk about is codependency. And I'm always curious to learn more. So I'm hoping through this podcast, we can bring a fresh perspective and understanding to this topic.
And codependency is described as a theory that attempts to explain imbalanced relationships where one person enables another person's self-destructive behavior, such as addiction, poor mental health, immaturity, irresponsibility, or underachievement. Did you want to add to that definition? Kind of break it down a little?
I would love if I could do more than just add to the definition, but give some context and process.
Yes, that'd be great.
I think sometimes when we give definitions, it gives us kind of like an arrow through the heart, but we live in context and we live in process. So when we're trying to make change, definitions help us think, but context and process help us change.
Yes.
And so what I would love to do is early on in this conversation, talk about two big pieces of growth and development that I think are crucial to understanding not just codependency, but the whole system around codependency. We were talking before the podcast about my thoughts and feelings about this topic. And I have a frustration when things get oversimplified. And I think sometimes just by defining something, we can oversimplify it because it is a largely contextual issue. So Having said that, can I jump in and just give two giant pieces of context?
Yes,
you
please
sure
do.
can.
So one of the things I tell people is that in the very beginning, often like first 2 to 3 sessions, depending on what they're asking for in our counseling practice, that there are two basic things, two really fundamental things that we need to have to live a life of genuine freedom. It's not going to sound very spiritual. It's not even going to sound very profound, at least until I explain a little bit, because the two things that we need are represented symbolically by the two things we need to keep living fish in our house. I know that sounds super not profound, but if you think about it, if you want to keep living fish in your house, there are two things you need. And I ask people, and they always say food and water. That's what you need to keep living cats and dogs. But really, the first thing you need is you need water and a tank.
Yeah, my son used to have a fish. So
Right. If you've got water without a tank, you've got wet carpet and dead fish. And if you've got a tank without water, you've got fish laying in the bottom of a tank and still dry and dead. And so those two things have this kind of mutual relationship, the tank and the water, and they represent these two things that everybody has to have to live a life of not just freedom, but health and wholeness. Those two things are identity and boundaries. And identity and boundaries have that same relationship. The water represents identity. It's the thing that fills us up. It's the essence of who we are, kind of that unique blueprint created in God's design and God's image. But the tank represents the boundaries that keep us in, and not only keep us in, but keep other things, influences, or other people out. And so when we live a healthy, balanced, free life, we have a strong, clear sense of who we are, and we know what's ours and what's not ours. We know when other people are trying to pollute our water, and we know what water is ours to keep, and we make choices about what water we give away. So those boundaries are such an essential piece of identity. And you'll see as we really develop this idea of what a lot of people call codependency, that both of those things get called into question when we start talking about the disordered relationships that come around addiction and abuse and the way that disorder happens in relationships, that both identity and boundaries get challenged and if not completely steamrolled over. And so that's the first kind of big picture context I want to give you, is that this idea that without boundaries and identity, the more challenged we are in those two areas, the less free, the less whole, the less able to live the life we're created for will be. The second one, and this will come up probably again and again throughout this conversation as well, is that the foundation of mental health, emotional health, and spiritual health is a progressive move that's simply known as the move from dependency to independence, or from dependence to independence, allowing us then to live in interdependent relationships. And that progression is supposed to happen in a very natural move when children raised in their family are dependent on the parents for everything from early on to change their diapers and to feed them and to make sure that they stay clean and they sleep when they're supposed to sleep. And as the kids grow, they're dependent on their parents to help them manage their emotional states and to manage their lives. And increasingly, parents manage elements of a child's life, but at some point, they're supposed to begin to let go and hand all those things from mental, emotional, physical processes over to a child, giving that child a clear sense that they are independent and not dependent. Now, you can even see in that the picture then of the fish tank, because what a parent's supposed to be doing is they're supposed to be filling in the glass or putting up the walls of the tank so the child knows that they're separate from their parents, that their motives are separate, that their initiative is separate, that their ability to achieve in life, their ability to manage their inside world is increasingly separate from their parents, so that by the time they leave home, they're not just able to pay their bills, they're able to manage their own souls without somebody else giving to them what they can give to themselves, and without their expectation that the world around them is in control of them, not them in control of themselves. Kind of the key piece of independence is, does the world run me or do I run the world around me? And keep in mind, again, that's not just about the physical things. It's not just about our bills and making sure that I do my own laundry. It's also about how do I manage my emotions? What achieving independence does for us is it allows us then to have interdependent relationships. And an interdependent relationship is one where both people come together, or a group of people come together, but nobody has any need to control anybody. Everybody manages themselves. And so anything that happens in collaboration or collusion is in completely free choice, where everybody chooses to give. They choose what to give and what not to give, and nobody uses manipulation or coercive tactics. They simply trust that each person involved will give to whatever they're capable of and whatever it is their unique contribution. So those interdependent relationships are incredibly free, where there's no pressure to be something that you're not.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That is beautiful.
And I like the picture, like, because I'm a visual learner, so I like kind of picturing the fish tank.
And I think that picture, everybody at least has a picture. If you've never owned fish, you've walked through a pet store, right?
Yeah.
And it really is genuinely the same relationship between the tank and the water, and the identity and the boundaries, is that we have to decide how we're going to manage what stays in and what goes out from us. And that keeps our water either clean or tainted. The last thing I want to say about the dependent piece, and this I think will launch us into the conversation about codependency, but I want you to hear that when somebody doesn't navigate the change from dependence to independence, there are a number of different ways that dependence lives out in process in our lives. Now, listen to these phrases: chemically dependent, alcohol dependent, codependent, right? In one sense, these are all dependent relationships. The key element being the expectation that something outside of me has to change for my life to work. And I have limited or no power to manage my own life if circumstances, people, and relationships don't do certain things for me. So a chemically dependent person looks to a substance, and a codependent person looks to a relationship.
Okay,
that
that's very well explained.
It is.
Love that. Love that.
And that's why I think a process more than a definition. The process is a codependent person is looking to the world around them to satisfy them, to make them happy, to give them a sense of, and here goes the fish tank, to give them a sense of identity. They look to the world around them to get the answer to the question, who am I?
That's great.
Yeah,
that is great.
That really breaks it down.
Well, when we were discussing the podcast and codependency before we talked today, you mentioned that attachment styles, especially the anxious attachment style, play a significant role in the addiction and the codependency cycle. Now, we did a podcast with Jenny Larson on attachment styles. It was number 80. If any of our listeners want to refresh or a deep dive into attachment theory, can you expound on how attachment styles play a role?
Yeah, for now, I would love to just kind of give a very quick overview of that, just in case people don't have time to go back to that other podcast. Okay. Attachment styles, essentially the way that I would describe it is, growing up in our family, we all develop a way to get a sense of comfort, safety, and security. And the way that we develop our comfort, safety, and security has something to do with the way that we, in our own family system, found comfort, safety, and security. So for the child who felt their comfort and security and sense of being in connection to their parents, and their parents are relatively healthy and give the child some independence while still giving them comfort, security, and a sense of identity, they develop what's called a secure attachment, which is they're able to attach, but they don't have a disruption in it. And they're able to develop the independence that we talked about while still knowing how to connect, but not in a dependent way. Well, the other attachment styles would be the child whose parents foster a dependent relationship, often develop some kind of dependent, either codependent or substance behavior dependent response to feeling safe and secure. And so what you see is that often somebody who finds their safety and security by distancing themselves from family. So the child who goes off to their room, the child who just wants to go, walking, the child who stays, I'm feeling frustrated. I just want time alone.
Is that avoidant?
Yes. Another teacher I've heard calls it a detacher, just someone who detaches for security. But the avoidant attachment style is really one that says, when I'm needing a sense of security and comfort, I just need some time alone. Intimacy is frightening to them, and so they stay back. And so you can see how when it comes to addicted people, an addiction is one way of filling in a dependency without letting people fill in that gap. Mm-hmm. And so often addicted people, or as I often say, addicts, abusers, and serial adulterers would be considered avoidant attachers. Well, that means that they partner, I'm going to say well, but that's kind of tongue in cheek. They partner well with the anxious attacher because the two of them form almost a complete whole, however dysfunctional it might be. So the anxious attacher brings all the emotional resource, and the avoidant attacher brings a willingness to be physically present, but allows the anxious attacher to fill in the emotional material. So you can see that that's almost the same thing as saying codependent, because what we're saying is the anxious attacher looks to a connection to another person to develop a sense of security, comfort, and identity. So it's very similar, if not exactly the same thing as what most people would call codependent. Is anxious attachment says, I'm not okay if I can't keep my partner very close. If they seem to need some space, need some distance, if they seem to be acting out in their addiction or whatever it might be, my nervous system goes into a panic and starts looking for ways to pull my partner back close, which then, of course, triggers the fear and anxiety of the avoidant attacher. And if they're an addict of some sort, then they get into this dance of anxious avoidant attachment or codependent, chemically dependent, where one is trying to create distance and the other is trying to cross that distance and get the other person to join them where they are.
That's interesting because I read so many marriage books when I was trying to help my marriage. And that's when I first learned about attachment styles. And I remember getting excited because I understood that I could recognize that my ex at the time, that he was avoidant and that I was anxious. And I was so excited. I'm like, I found the solution. I'm just anxious, you're avoidant, but it didn't fix our marriage, but it definitely, that's what started me getting interested in attachment style. So when you were describing that, I was like, I could totally picture that dynamic that was going on in our marriage.
And therein lies the dilemma of both the person labeled codependent and the anxious attacher, is they are constantly looking for the solution to fix things, while the other person is really just looking for some peace of mind by avoiding.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just find attachment style so fascinating.
Very interesting.
Because it helps you understand yourself and your dynamics with other people. And it's, and we're not all one thing. Like we all have different, you're not 100% anxious or 100% avoidant. We kind of all probably have mixture at different times, depending on who we're dealing with, but it's really interesting.
Super helpful framework, but it still takes two to tango.
Yeah, definitely.
One very helpful thing to me, by the way, is I realized about a year ago that the avoidant attachment style is still an attachment style.
Yeah.
In other words, to the anxious attacher, the avoidant attacher looks like they're trying to leave the relationship. But avoidant attachment is still a form of trying to connect.
They're just doing it the only way they know how, I guess.
Yeah. They're afraid that if they show up too much, they're going to chase the other person away. They're afraid that they're so broken, they'll hurt somebody. And so the barriers that they erect are really their failed attempt, but their attempt to say, I want to preserve our relationship by not doing too much damage to it.
That's interesting.
I think that's probably where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm more avoidant than anxious now, but I think it's because of everything I've gone through.
Yeah, that's what we've been through. And it's like, I just want to heal first.
Yeah.
I want to be independent, but that independent soul, like you're talking about. And I'm close and I'm getting there. So it's not really being avoidant. It's, healing.
Just working on being secure.
Yeah. Being secure. Yeah. We're working on the secure attachments. What we're doing. So we're being avoidant while we're trying to work on secure.
Yeah.
Secure and independent really are the same. What it says is, I'm okay no matter what's going on around me.
Yeah, that's what we're all striving for.
Yeah. So I can be at peace if the person I love the most is, active in their addiction, if they've completely distanced themselves, if they're making threats. I can be peaceful inside if I'm moving towards independence and learning to be secure, not in my connection to them, but in my internal world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when we grow up with neglect or in dysfunctional family, which who hasn't grown up in a dysfunctional family, we can feel at an early age that we need to carry the emotional responsibility of a parent. And this isn't intended, but it happens. And I remember even myself, I'm not sure why, but I remember seeing my mom cry at an early age. And I just remember even at the time feeling like I was responsible for that, or there was something in me responsible for that. Can you explain how that gets started?
Yeah, obviously there's subtle differences in every single family. One of the things as a family therapist who's practiced with families and individuals for 30 years now, I guess more, 31, anyway, for a long time, every family is its own culture. And so I almost feel like I'm a missionary every time I meet a new family or a new client, because I'm learning a brand new culture with a brand new set of language and a brand new, set of formation processes.
Yeah.
But the answer to how does that get started, go back to the fish tank with the boundaries and the identity. And again, how those two things are related. Now, we all learn who we are in what I call the relational mirrors around us. In other words, every meaningful relationship in our life mirrors back to us a picture of who they consider us to be. And so, especially those early relationships like mom and dad, and, if we've got siblings or aunts and uncles or grandparents that are close, those early relationships, the way that they interact with us, usually not nearly as much what they say, but much more what they do. Their willingness to connect or not connect, whether they seem to trust us or mistrust us, whether they validate us or don't validate us. Those things all are subtle messages about who we are. And little children, though they may not have the language of that, they take in those subtle messages. Now, to answer your question about how does somebody start feeling responsible for somebody else, there was a movie that came out a couple years called Inside Out by Pixar.
Oh, yeah.
And if you haven't seen it, it's these 5 characters that live inside a girl's brain. I think it's joy, anger, fear, sadness, and disgust, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And they're basically the 5 primary emotions that drive us. And the story is about an 11-year-old girl whose family moves from this beautiful place on the east to San Francisco for her dad to take on a new job. And both the move and the new destination are pretty upsetting to this little girl. I don't want to say traumatic, but potentially pretty upsetting to her. There's a moment in there where she's really struggling and her dad has just left the house because something went wrong with the job or something went wrong. And he's had to leave in a hurry and kind of frustrated. And the little girl has had a very difficult day. And the mom looks at her and says, you've been so good through this whole thing. It's really helped your dad. We appreciate just how you've smiled all the way through this. And, if you could just understand that dad is going through a hard time, but we're so grateful for how good you've been. And the girl puts on like a very 1/10 smile, but you see the pain in her eyes. And the mom goes, "That's my good girl right there." Mm-hmm. And you feel the weight shift to this little 11-year-old girl, where you can see that she feels like, well, then I can't tell them I've had a bad day because dad had a worse day and they need me to be the good girl.
Yeah. They don't need to see me struggling.
Implication is a much more powerful message than is a direct statement. Because a direct statement, the mind can resist and the will can resist. But implication almost feels like you just inhaled and it came in when you inhaled it. And so those moments where there's just a subtle implication, hey, really helped me when you handled things that way. Or would you take care of the baby for just a moment? Mom's having a really hard time and I just really need you to change this diaper. Well, it's not just asking you to change a diaper. Mom's having a hard time and I need you to carry some emotional weight. So those subtle statements that imply something, a little child takes those very seriously is not just the right word. It's a very powerful wave of emotion and meaning into a child's developing soul.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
I just went through some EMDR therapy and a lot of it had to stem from like my birth and those younger, when I was like between 1 and 2 years old, I had a lot of traumatic things happen. And I realized my brain wasn't even developed enough to even understand what was going on. And so that's how it helped me so much, is to know the truth about, my mom was sick. Like she couldn't have done anything, like reasoning with that, because when you're little, your brain just can't even comprehend any of it.
Right. Everything is so basic when you're a child.
Yeah.
You haven't developed language, much less the ability to think abstractly at all.
Yeah.
So everything's very concrete. Words mean exactly what they say. And it's very confusing when parents say things. And especially when there's subtle things that you can feel, but can't put into language, it almost kind of inserts itself into one's heart.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you mentioned in an article in Psychology Today that the partners of abusers don't get pulled into a relationship because they're codependent. Sometimes a partner could be labeled as codependent when it's actually a trauma response. So the victim is in survival mode, but it just appears as codependency. Most of the time, the abuser is initially attracted to the independent, strong qualities of the victim. Can you expound on this?
Yeah, it's tricky. And this is one of the ways where I don't like the oversimplifications of just putting out a word called codependency and not having some of that bigger contextual issues. I think the main reason both that article and my thoughts and conversations I have with people, first of all, I hesitate to just say to people, you are codependent, right? If we still have those dependent characteristics at all, and we're looking to either a circumstance, a person, or anything like that outside of us to get a sense of self-identity and comfort, then we have to do something different no matter what we're attaching to or looking to for a sense of identity. But what happens a lot of times with abuse is that, just like you said, the abuser is looking for the resource, the emotional or other type of resource. So whether it be sex or service or emotional support, the abuser is looking for somebody that has a resource. So there is a degree of strength that a person brings to that, strength and independence. They function with the ability to give away their own resource to help somebody else. And if they don't have what would be classically considered a codependent past, just the generosity of a person, the thoughtfulness, the forbearance of somebody who's willing to be in a relationship and carry somebody else's weight for any period of time, that very generous and kind quality is something that an abuser targets and then and here's the key, will slowly grow that aspect of them in incredibly manipulative ways. And as stereotypical as this is, a very healthy person or a fairly healthy person with just a willingness to help others. And of course, it helps if depending on what role they may have played in their family of origin and their levels of empathy. But a very healthy person can be bought into the love bombing of an abuser's pursuit of somebody. And then bit by bit, the abuser does this thing that we all call grooming. Grooming, we typically in culture today, we talk about grooming from the perspective of pedophiles grooming children or grooming the families of children. But an abuser grooms somebody by subtly and step by step testing the waters to see what they'll tolerate and then backing out if the person shows signs of not tolerating the abusive behavior, the manipulative behavior. And what they're doing is they're testing to see how far they can go. And then they'll step back and say they were joking. They'll step back and apologize and just kind of go on. But then the next time they groom, they'll go a little bit further. And the next time they'll groom, they go a little bit further. So there's a cycle of almost like reeling in a large fish. You pull it in and then you let some tension off the line. Then you pull it in, you let some tension off the line until somebody who's kind and generous starts to realize, wow, this person really needs more from me.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're married and you get married and it's like you realize that.
Well, yeah, I just remember my ex saying to my son one day after years and years of doing that, I realized he was grooming me because I had no idea I was a good person. And he just remembered him saying to my son, oh, your mom will never leave me, because he did that. He tested the water. He just kept testing the waters to see how much I would actually take.
Well, let me contrast that with a story. This is a true story that I actually have permission to tell. It's not a client. It's a friend of mine from years and years ago. And I got her permission to tell the story when I was doing some writing. She married somebody who the day after they were married physically beat her black and blue. And by the way, his dad had done that for years. He was a leader in a Christian ministry and just had kept his wife secretly physically beaten down all these years. So this boy had watched this. And so when he got married the day after the wedding, he just beats his new wife black and blue. And she looks at him and says, you touch me again and I will walk away and divorce you. And he says, you're now my wife. I can do whatever I want. And he backhands her. She grabs whatever she can and walks out the door and goes straight to an attorney's office and divorces him the first week of their marriage.
Wow.
That's the opposite. The frog in hot water principle is what an abuser presumes upon, which is, listen, I can't just pull the trigger and beat you tomorrow.
Right.
I need to first see what happens if I yell.
Yeah. Got to slow
down. First see what happens if I hit the wall next to you or if I hit an animal.
Right.
I need to tiptoe into this thing. And bit by bit, there's almost a sense of indebtedness that takes place that says, now I've let this much go. I can't really make a big deal out of it now. But again, that frog in hot water principle says that as long as the groomer, as long as the abuser takes their time, they can move a fairly healthy person into an abuse victim who simply has decided, okay, I'm going to invest in helping this person. I think I said this in the podcast about the abuse dynamics, but I always say that most abuse victims don't think of themselves as victims. They think of themselves as special helpers. And so they didn't start out expecting to deal with abuse psychologically, emotionally, or even physically. They started out thinking, I can help this person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've helped abuse victims that still feel like, they get out and they still think they're helping
their job
them.
to help.
Yeah.
It's hard to get out of that role.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah. And we talked about that earlier before we started the podcast, but I wasn't even sure that I was codependent because I wasn't codependent at all when I met him. But now after years and years and years and years of abuse, because he didn't hit me till we had our first son a year in, and I was already had a kid.
Well, and you had a son, and so you've got literally some skin in the game.
Yeah,
I think the difference between what we've been describing and what would be considered more a classical codependent is the codependent is actually searching for that kind of relationship. They're pre-programmed by their family of origin, and they're looking to unconsciously, at least, if not consciously, they're looking to reproduce what they already know.
Yeah,
the victim may walk in completely a clean slate.
So maybe really look at how they were before they got into that relationship and try to get back to that independent soul. Is that a good way to explain it?
I say that all the time. In fact, when somebody is finally at that point where they're saying, okay, I've got to do something different in this relationship and I've got to get well, what I tell them is I want you to think back to who you were before you met that partner.
Yeah.
If you were an athlete, tell me about your athletics. If you were a musician, tell me about your music. If you were, what were the hopes and dreams you had back then? Because as much as we don't want to go backwards, you want to go to a place where you can remember who you are.
Yes.
Right. Because you lose yourself. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. And then you talk about the importance of interconnected relationships where each person has his or her own needs met and strives to meet the needs of the other person. This does not describe an abusive or destructive relationship. In our podcast with you on the dynamics of abuse, you really made that clear. And there's a big dynamic at play when the victim is carrying all or most of the responsibility of the relationship and the perpetrator does not want to carry the responsibility. It's kind of like you were saying, it's just they have this pattern with each other that they both feel comfortable with and it's happy to let the person carry it. And so in those relationships and those type of relationships, someone's listening to this and, can maybe recognize some of these things. How can the light start going on so they can start recognizing this dynamic?
Yeah, that's a hard question because.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 of Codependency with Bob Hamp. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.